And the reality is what we call classics is actually a white supremacist reception that's reflected in textbooks, academic journals, other instructional material, and the composition of our field. And it exists as a force outside of what we control as individuals. So when I think about what needs to change and how classics needs to be different, I tend to think in terms of loss, responsibility, restoration, and reparation. So if we're promoting a white supremacist appropriation of classics, that represents a huge loss in terms of what it once was and what it could be. So I tend to think in terms of this hypothetical: if classics is unbound from whiteness, what does that look like? And then what is our responsibility as classicists in light of this? And how can we make it right? And one very small thing I started doing is I do not teach classics anymore, Latin, without talking about the history of classics and access to classics. And I do not teach without explaining how white supremacy is embedded in the field and how white supremacists leverage classics to legitimize their hatred and violence. And I think in this climate, it's important to talk to kids about what they're studying and how it's been used. So first, I'm going to show you a couple of ways that we collectively tend to prevent change just through our discourse and responses to activism and change, because there's built-in mechanisms that maintain the status quo. And then I'm going to run through a few practical ways and a couple steps we can take to affect change outside of our own sphere of influence, to affect the kind of change we can't do alone. And I do want to say at this point, there are situations, many situations, where it is not safe to do activism and it's not safe to speak up, and that is a feature of white supremacy that's built in. There's mechanisms that silence people who would be inclined to speak out, because if you don't have a job, it's just such a huge risk that comes with speaking out at times. So I'll have a couple case studies and then we'll have some time for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a couple of slides, and we're just going to start with some responses that tend to shut down attempts for change. And I also want to mention, and I think I did at the beginning, there's been people working for change for decades. Shelley Haley had an article, I believe it was from the 80s, that, you know, it's just why are we still talking about this? Why is this still such a big problem right now? Okay, so here we have some responses that tend to hinder change. So we have prioritizing white feelings and experiences, and I think I alluded to that before. A lot of white classicists are very, very comfortable with what's going on, and that sometimes the response tends to be something that I imagine, you know, is trying to be reassuring, like, I've never seen this before, don't worry, it's not actually a problem. All of my students have a good time. Another very, very common one that you'll see in plenty of other contexts as well is people aren't ready for change, slow down. Tone checks, your tone is alienating. And this is an emergency. You know, people should have a sense of alarm that we're having slave auctions in 2019, or that promotional material for classics talks about helping people become more mainstream, helping non-Western people become more mainstream. And those are talking points that are put out there for high school teachers to use when they recruit. And I think they've been taken down, but they're still available other places on the internet. Second is providing a counterproductive counter narrative. So if you're providing a counter narrative to what's going on in classics, it doesn't have to be this way. There tends to be a pull, and this has happened several times, where the same day I've written an essay or tweeted about something, there's a push to let's all tweet about why we love classics, and that suppresses the narrative that challenges the status quo. Anthropomorphizing organizations. These are good people. So that's, you know, framing activism as a harm to individual good people. Big one that you'll see even outside of activism, it's just diverting from race. That happens in conversations. Dr. Dugan was on a panel with Dr. Arti Mehta and Dr. Shelley Haley, and it was a panel on anti-racism, and so many of the questions brought it back around to something that can affect white people as well. So that happens quite a bit. The one I see the most or tend to hear the most is people wanting to talk about socioeconomic status and leave race out of it, which I think Dr. Collins also addressed, this morning in terms of this colorblind fallacy. Tends to be creating straw men. Oh, so now we're going to argue about whether or not we hate classics. Like, we are doing this because we hate classics, and that becomes the topic. Another one is that I've seen lately with regard to some things going on with costume contests in the National Junior Classical League that are based on stories of Ovid. Oh, so you don't want to read the texts anymore. Stigmatizing discourse about white supremacy, and there's literature on a lot of these aspects. I mean, if you do a lit review for racist discourse strategy, there's literature on how white people stymie and hinder change, or how they respond to racism. So a big one too is stigmatizing discourse about white supremacy. Like, oh my gosh, she's saying we're white supremacists, as if naming it is somehow this super horrible thing that's even worse than white supremacy itself. And there's a quote under that from a Dutch scholar, and I think people who have spoken out against racism could probably relate to this, that the person who accuses the other as racist is in turn accused of inverted racism against whites as oversensitive and exaggerating, intolerant, and generally seeing racism where there is none. Another common response is prioritizing positive self-presentation. So that's where you'll see sort of either performative wokeness in terms of, I'll get out and tweet about this, but I'm not really in it, or performative statements from organizations that want to maintain a positive self-image without actually affecting real change. That's something to look out for, especially when organizations release statements. Individualizing and localizing. In my advocacy around sexual violence, I often tell my story, but it's important to connect the story to a larger cause so that it's affecting change and it's not just helping an individual. Although I will say there's certainly times where everybody should come together, even in outrage fashion, and rally around someone who's been harmed. But in general, if it becomes about an individual, or if you're minimizing the problem or localizing it, well, they stopped doing that, now we're good. So the key is to keep an eye on the systemic issue. And there's many more, but I mean, another one is both sidesing. So I think a big impediment to change has been a desire to accommodate both sides, as if a little bit of white supremacy is okay. Silence is another big one. Deliberate silence, just like selective activism, is a privilege. And silence can be co-opted and appropriated as consent in a way where silence begets more silence. So I'm not going to run through all of the points on here, but if you look up Noelle Newman's spiral of silence theory, she has research, and there's a ton of spin-off research, but essentially what happens is that the majority viewpoint, or what is perceived as the majority, sort of suppresses a little bit people who hold a minority viewpoint and then at that point people feel less comfortable speaking, so that the majority viewpoint and its strength is perceived as larger than it even is. And at that point, what happens is there's a big fear of ostracism or rejection from the group. So membership in a group is leveraged to keep people quiet. If you speak up, you're not one of us anymore. And I've experienced that both in classics and in terms of the sports community. I was a swimmer. You're sort of out. Like, if you're going to criticize the organization, you can't be one of us. So here are some steps in terms of activism. There's many ways of going about this, and I want to be clear, you don't need to do all of these, but when I sit down to try to figure out, okay, how am I going to make a difference here, these are the steps I use. And I've had people help me through all the steps. I've had people help on 1 or 2 steps. I'm involved with groups where I will do 1 step as part of a sort of activism by committee, which is great. I think that works out really well when you could divide up the tasks, or divide tasks up based on people's strengths. So you're going to identify a problem, and it helps to really kind of look at a root cause. What could be causing this? What's the real problem here? So you're looking at something that could possibly have a solution. Number 2 is the coalition building. So you're going to try to find allies. And there are many people right now, I mean, looking at this about a year later from when I picked things up, who are very much on board and very focused on the problems in secondary classics. In general, though, I found it easier to get allies related to activism related to sexual violence. But it's helpful to find allies. They could be individuals, they can be organizations. Recently, the Black Legislative Caucus in Virginia stepped up and helped out, actually really took the lead on issues with the National Latin Exam. Within our field, we have MRAC, we have Hilltop, a lot of the organizations that are sponsoring this event are organizations that can be strong allies in these types of endeavors.